The direct path. All spiritual masters have had one purpose: to help men overcome the powerful illusion of the ego and abide in the perfect bliss of the self, or at any rate to approach towards this. Their expositions have never been philosophy in the modern sense of the word, that is, speculation as to the nature of being. They have been a theoretical basis for the practical work of the path. A master, therefore, while teaching one theoretical basis, might recognize that a different one represents another aspect of truth, and would serve as a basis for a different path. To criticize and compare them as philosophies in the modern sense is like comparing a living horse with a hobby horse. The shape may be the same, but the factor of life is overlooked. Masters have used more open or veiled language in their expositions to suit the understanding of those to whom the message was given. In India and China, many have declared the ultimate truth openly, that only the self is, that you are nothing other than the self, that the universe is a mere manifestation of the self, without inherent reality, existing only in the self. This can be understood by the analogy of a dream. The whole dream world with all its people and events exists only in the mind of the dreamer. Its creation or emergence takes nothing away from him, and its dissolution or reabsorption adds nothing to him. He remains the same before, during, and after. God, the conscious dreamer of the conscious dream, is the self, and no person in the dream has any reality apart from the self of which he is an expression. By discarding the illusion of otherness, you can realize that identity with the self which always was, is, and will be, beyond the conditions of life and time. Then, since you are one with the dreamer, the whole universe, including your life and all others, is your dream, and none of the events in it have more than a dream reality. You are set free from hope and desire, fear and frustration, and established in the unchanging bliss of pure being. This explanation bears a superficial resemblance to a theory that was once toyed with in Western philosophy, sufficient at any rate for caution to be necessary. The theory is that only I exist, and all others are figments of my mind. This would be like saying that one person in the dream creates all the others, which is absurd. The truth is that the mind of the dreamer creates this person as well as all the others. When one realizes his identity with the dreamer, his own life, as well as those of others, becomes a part of his dream. Or, to change the analogy, the Western travesty would be that one character in a play is real and creates all the others, which is absurd. The truth being that both this character and the others are invented by the playwright, so that the realized man is like the actor who, knowing that the part he acts is not himself, acts it with equanimity, unaffected by its good or evil fortune. Teachers of the West and Near East have, on the whole, been more veiled in the language of their expositions. However, no such division can be absolute. In the West there have been those who have proclaimed the supreme identity, while in India there have been tantric, Vedic, and bhakti teachers who have guided men along the paths of duality to unity. The final goal is the same, even though those who follow the less direct paths of duality may not perceive it at the beginning, or may only recognize it in theory without making it their constant sadhana, or may deny it and persecute those who proclaim it. Some spiritual masters have come to confirm the law and the prophets in founding a new religion, thereby establishing a complete pattern of life for a whole community, as well as a path for those who are drawn consciously towards the goal which ultimately none can evade. Therefore, they have had to clothe their more direct teaching in parables and symbols which could have an outer meaning for all who do not aspire beyond the ethics and devotion religion. Within the framework of a religion, some have, in the same way, lived for the spiritual revitalization of the whole community, as well as for the few who strive with consciousness of the goal. Others have confined themselves more or less exclusively to guiding aspirants on the path and have spoken a clear language. In either case, one of the signs of genuineness has been that they have lived and taught strictly within the framework of their religion. Bhagavan Sri Ramana conforms to none of these categories. He came neither to found a new religion, nor to give guidance strictly within an existing one, but to open a path to those who seek in all religions, the world over. The mode of his teaching is a response to the conditions of the world in which he came. Today, at the end of the Kali Yuga, the world has reached a state of unprecedented spiritual darkness. In some countries, religion is denounced, and men are taught to accept the material world and physical life as all there is. In other countries, countless numbers limit themselves to the material and physical, whether or not they nominally profess any religion. Even those countries which still acknowledge a religion glory in having deprived it of all control over the lives of men or the education of children. A science of the mind has been developed in complete ignorance of the spirit, which is its source, and presumes to analyze a man while leaving out the one thing that is his essence. All religions have dwindled in numbers proportionally, that is, to the size of the population, and in spiritual power. In Christian countries, the initiatic paths to realization have been more or less completely lost, so that most who call themselves Christians are ignorant that there ever were any. In other communities also, they are fewer and less potent than ever before. Often they have gone underground, and their masters are hard to find, while false self-styled masters are as vociferous as they are dangerous, and old truths are given forth in garbled form mixed with modern errors. And yet, it is a law of the cycles that the reascent is always prepared before the nadir is reached. And it is also true today that books of ancient wisdom are accessible in all languages, and the doctrine of Advaita, of oneness with the self, is openly proclaimed in the West as well as the East. It is also true that physical science itself has at last found the material world not to be material, since there is no solid matter, but only atoms which are reducible to energy rather than matter. Coupled with this mental reawakening is a dread of the chaos towards which the once vaunted progress is leading mankind, and as a result, many, both in the West and the East, are drawing back disgusted from the crude violence and the hollow platitudes of a material civilization and groping for spiritual reality. This is the circumstance of Bhagavan's living on earth among us, and of the message he brought and the path he made open. The task performed by Bhagavan Sri Ramana was to reopen the direct path of self-inquiry, which had become too arduous for a spiritually dark age. This path, with its theoretical basis of Advaita, stands, so to speak, as the source from which the various religions diverge, and can therefore be approached from any side. Whether there are many or few who take it is not the question, only that it has been made open. In itself, but for the grace of Bhagavan, it would be the most inaccessible to modern man on account of its very simplicity, and directness. It requires no ritual or forms of worship, no priesthood or congregation, no outer signs or special observances, but can be practiced in the workshop, kitchen, or city office, as well as in the monastery or hermitage. Also, it requires no great burden of theory. Its description as jnana marga, the path of knowledge or intellect, sometimes leads to the idea that it is more philosophical than other paths. But the opposite is true. It is the sword that cuts through the Gordian knot of philosophy. The structure of spiritual philosophy or science, whichever one many choose to call it, is vast. Its ramifications may be bewildering. On various paths, more or less theoretical knowledge has to be mastered, and usually the less direct the path, the greater the need for theory. Only on the direct path, the one stupendous truth of Advaita, like a veritable sword flash, cuts through the entanglements and is all the theory needed. The whole intricate theory of posthumous development falls away, since it is necessary to discover what you are now and in eternity, not what you will be when you die. The traditional doctrine of cycles of history is unnecessary, since the wise man is always in Satya Yuga. The complex yogic and tantric sciences of the non-physical powers and modalities of man and the techniques for developing them are superfluous, since you are not all that but the self. The vast fabric of spiritual cosmology, expounding the stages of devolution from the formless substratum down to the state of physical man and the stages of man's return, does not arise when the cosmos is to be looked upon simply as a dream from which to awaken. On all these branches of spiritual science, Bhagavan usually refused to answer questions, repeating that what is needed is to concentrate on the self that you really are. However, it is not only in its simplicity of application and its freedom from the inessential that the path of Bhagavan opened for us is the most direct. It is so intrinsically. This can perhaps be best explained by outlining briefly the initial position of the aspirant, then the task before him, and finally the methods of accomplishing it. The initial position is that of Atma, the self or spirit alone is, and is manifested in all the forms of the universe and in your being, without ever ceasing from its formless, changeless state. But there also appears to be an ego, an individual self, which imagines itself a real and separate being, as though one of the persons in a dream should imagine himself to exist apart from the mind of the dreamer. The self is in unchanging bliss and perfection, without birth or death, beginning or end. The ego is in unceasing turmoil, plagued by hope and fear, anxiety and regret, attachment and bereavement, and foredoomed to death. But as its sole good, the ego has an intuition of the self, which it conceives of as a greater being, infinitely good, unfathomably wise, boundlessly loving, and it calls this being God. The task is to extinguish the ego's sense, so that only the self which alone was, is, and will be, remains in consciousness and sees all this panorama as its own manifestation. As an expression of this, Bhagavan often said laughingly, "You have only to disrealize unreality, and reality will appear." This task normally means passing from unity through duality to unity. For at the beginning it appears to the aspirant that his ego is the one indisputable reality. Then he feels the reality of both the ego and God or self. And the end is when the ego sense is dissolved. The ways of undertaking this task are innumerable, but it will suffice here to divide them into three general categories: that of esoteric religion, that of indirect spiritual paths, and that of the direct path of self-inquiry. The way of esoteric religion is to progressively replace egoism by submission to the will of God. Its four cardinal demands are faith, love, humility, and good deeds. Insofar as they are complied with, they effectively bring a man towards self-realization, even though he does not consciously envisage this. True, the goal is not likely to be attained in this lifetime, but in God's patience, a lifetime is very little. Faith strengthens the intuitional conviction of the reality of God or the self. Humility, its counterpart, weakens the belief in the ego and lessens the importance attached to it. Love strives to surrender the ego to God and its welfare to others. Good deeds deny egoism in practice and are like the fruit and the proof of love and humility. Therefore, Bhagavan sometimes encouraged this way in speaking to those whose nature did not draw them to a more conscious sadhana. The way of indirect sadhana, that is spiritual paths more conscious of the goal than esoteric religion, but less direct than self-inquiry, is to strengthen, purify, and harmonize the mind by various techniques and to hold it to the quest of the self, which is often conceived as father, mother, or lover. Bhagavan never denied the efficacy of such methods. Once, when a lady said that self-inquiry did not help her and asked whether she could follow some other way, he replied, "All ways are good." However, since by his grace he was opening a more direct and potent path and one more suited to the conditions of modern life, he did consistently deprecate men's following other, less direct paths. He referred to them as like the thief turned policeman to catch the thief that is himself. The thief is the ego, or mind, which usurps the reality of the self. For by these indirect methods of sadhana, the mind is trained as a policeman to catch and condemn itself. On such a path there is the danger that the thief-turned-policeman may acquire police powers and then his thievish nature reassert itself and do far more harm than it ever could before. The ego may acquire powers and perceptions beyond the physical, and then persuade itself and others that it is the self, and become that most terrible scourge, a false guru, consuming others to feed its unconfessed vanity. Or it may simply entrench itself as some high post which it imagines to be final, but which, beautiful though it may be, it is no more final than is the physical body. In any case, the mind must at last be extinguished in the self which alone is. So it is simpler and more direct for it to strive to do so from the beginning by awakening the self-awareness of the self and subsiding before that awareness. And that is the direct path as taught by Bhagavan, to forget the ego and discover the self, not as one self discovering another, but by awakening self-awareness of the self, by beginning occasionally and imperfectly at first, but ever more constantly and powerfully to be the self. It is in this sense that knowing is being. Bhagavan's instruction was to ask yourself, who am I? I am not this body which changes but leaves me the same, nor am I these thoughts which pass through the mind and go out again, leaving me the same. 10 years ago I had thoughts, emotions, aspirations, which are gone now, but I am still the same. What then am I? This is far from being a mental puzzle. Bhagavan's instruction was, while meditating, to concentrate the consciousness on the heart. not the physical heart on the left, but the spiritual heart on the right side of the chest. He was especially insistent on this supreme center of consciousness. The following is one of the more simple illustrations that he gave of it. When a schoolboy says, "It is I that did the sum," or when he asks you, "Shall I run and get the book for you?" does he point to the head that did the sum or to the legs that will carry him to get you the book? No. In both cases, his finger is pointed quite naturally to the right side of the chest, thus giving innocent expression to the profound truth that the source of I-ness in him is there. It is an unerring intuition that makes him refer to himself, to the heart, which is the self, in that way. The act is quite involuntary and universal. That is to say, it is the same in the case of every individual. He insisted that it is necessary to try, not to argue. You should try to have rather than to locate the experience. A man need not find out where his eyes are situated in order to see. The heart is there, ever open to you, if you care to enter it, ever supporting all your movements, even when you are unaware. After some practice, this meditation awakens a current of awareness, a consciousness of I in the heart, not the ego sense, but a feeling of the essential I who is the universal self, unaffected by good or ill fortune, or by sickness or health. This consciousness should be developed by constant effort until it becomes more and more frequent, and finally a constant undertone to all the actions of life. Then all that is needed is to refrain from interference by egoism so that it may deepen into an ever vaster peace beyond all understanding, until the moment when it will consume the ego and remain as the abiding realization of self. If various thoughts come up during meditation, one should not get caught up by them and follow them out, but look at them objectively and ask, where did this thought come from, and why, and to whom? And so they pass away like clouds across a clear sky, and each thought leads back to the basic I thought. And who am I? It is of the very essence of the meditation that there is no mental or verbal answer. There cannot be, since the self transcends thought and words. The ego is seeking what is before its origin and beyond its source, and the answer will not be grasped by it, but will grasp and devour it. I came to devour thee, but thou hast devoured me. Now there is peace, Arunachala. A verse written by Bhagavan. The beginning of the answer is the awakening of a current of awareness, a sense of being in the heart. This awareness is neither physical nor mental, though body and mind are both aware of it. It can no more be described than hearing could be described to a deaf man. If impure thought arise during meditation, they are to be looked at and dispelled in the same way. For thus the evil tendencies in one are discovered and dissipated. All kinds of thoughts arise in meditation. That is only right, for what lies hidden in you is brought out. Unless it rises up, how can it be destroyed? Just as self-inquiry is not a mental exercise, so also it is not a mantram. Bhagavan replied quite definitely when asked that it should not be repeated as a mantram but used as above indicated. Every spiritual path requires both purity of living and intensity of spiritual effort, and the vichara was given by Bhagavan as a technique of pure and dispassionate living, no less than as a technique of meditation. If anything happens to offend or flatter you, who is injured? Who is pleased or angry? Who am I? The word frustration is much in vogue nowadays, but who is frustrated? So, by use of the vichara, the I am the doer illusion can be destroyed, and it is possible to take part in the life of the world aloofly, without vanity or attachment. Bhagavan represented it as the bank cashier, who handles enormous sums of money unemotionally and yet quite efficiently, because he knows that it is not his money. In the same impersonal way, a man can attend to all the affairs of life, knowing that he, the real self, is unaffected by them, and every attack of greed, anger, or desire can be dispelled by vichara. It must be dispelled, because it is no use repeating that one is the self and acting as though one were the ego. Real, even partial, awareness of the self weakens egoism. Egoism, whether expressed as vanity, greed, or desire, is a proof that recognition of the self is merely mental. This means that in adapting an ancient path to modern conditions, Bhagavan has, in effect, created a new path. The ancient path of self-inquiry was pure, jnana marga, to be followed by the recluse in silence and solitude, withdrawn from the outer world. Bhagavan has made it a path to be followed invisibly in the world, in the conditions of modern life. He never encouraged any to give up life in the world. He explained that it will only be exchanging the thought, I am a householder, for the thought, I am a sannyasin, whereas what is necessary is to reject the thought, I am the doer, completely, and remember only, I am. And this can be done by means of the vichara, as well as in the city as in the jungle. It is only inwardly that a man can leave the world by leaving the ego sense. It is only inwardly that he can withdraw into solitude by abiding in the universal solitude of the heart, which is solitude only because there are no others, however many forms the self may assume. Life in the world is not merely permissible, but a useful part of the karma marga inherent in the way of Bhagavan. The outer discipline of self-inquiry is a constant check on actions and on the motive from which they spring. Sincerely and constantly applied, it removes the need for any formal code of conduct, for it strikes directly at the egoism in every action and reaction. The impulses of the ego will not change immediately. An insult will still cause anger, and a flattering remark, pleasure. Attachment to property and comfort will still continue. The senses will still clamor. But all such impulses will be exposed for what they are, so that the result will be to recognize one's egoism and feel shame and reluctance over each of its manifestations. From that point, its eradication will begin, but only by constant effort and remembering. And yet, even so, it may be asked how such a path can be integral if it does not leave room for bhakti, that is, for love and devotion. For the path of bhakti presupposes a conception of duality of the other to whom one submits. However, the grace of Bhagavan was too vast to exclude any possibility. Although he spoke of it less frequently, the path he opened did include submission and devotion also. He said, there are two ways. Either ask yourself, who am I? Or submit. And even more explicitly he said, submit to me, and I will strike down the mind. It was not a matter of another alternate path. Devotion to the Guru is a powerful and essential ingredient of the direct path that Bhagavan taught us. It is true that he reminded us that the real Guru is in the heart, and once the mind turns to seek him, he draws it ever more powerfully to himself. But to begin the process, the outer guru is needed, for as he said, the outer guru gives the mind a push inward, and the inner guru pulls it. And Bhagavan is the universal Sadguru, who of his grace opens the path to every man who turns to him, and ultimately the two gurus are one. It was so when he was with us in the body. He said, the guru is one. But it is more obviously so now than ever, since the apparent duality of outer and inner guru has been removed. Submission is all that is needed. Bhagavan said, only keep quiet and Bhagavan will do the rest. That is the great task, through devotion to Bhagavan and self-inquiry, to keep the mind quiet. For it is like a monkey in constant vain agitation. Only when it submits and is quiet can the Guru, who is the Self, be heard. As on every path, progress is gradual and requires constant effort, whether or not there be the radiant foreglow of truth come and gone again. Bhagavan expressly warned the disciple for whom he wrote self-inquiry. However, the self-oblivious ego, even when once made aware of the self, does not get liberation, that is self-realization, on account of the obstruction of accumulated mental tendencies, and it frequently confuses the body with the self. Long cultivated tendencies are to be eradicated only by long continued meditation. A miracle such as Bhagavan's own immediate realization of the self is not to be achieved by others, and he never led them to expect it. Actually, to desire success or even to think about it is itself an impediment, since it means desiring achievement for the ego instead of trying to extinguish the ego by asking, who am I? The vibrant awareness of self is to be made more frequent and uninterrupted until it awakens as soon as one sits in meditation, and then until it becomes constant, not only in hours of meditation, but underlying all the actions of life. In proportion as it grows stronger and more continuous, the ego is weakened, and what comes to the same, purified in preparation for its final immolation. Bhagavan said, the moment the ego self tries to know itself, it changes in character. It begins to partake less and less of the body in which it is absorbed, and more of pure consciousness, the self or Atman. The 40 verses composed by Bhagavan are the doctrine of the direct path. In verses 29 and 30, he thus succinctly describes it. The path of self-knowledge is only to dive inward with the mind, not uttering the word I, and to question whence as I it arises. To meditate, this is not I or that I am, may be an aid, but how can it form the inquiry? When the mind inwardly inquiring, who am I, attains the heart, something of itself manifests as I, so that the individual I must bow in shame. Though manifesting, it is not I by nature but perfection, and this is the self. The direct path awakens love through knowledge. It is not knowledge of one by another or mind knowledge, but the awakening bliss of the self, to which the mind is drawn and in which it is absorbed in love.